Welcome to the Nightbird Radio Podcast. I'm Timothy Saylor, and I'm going to be your host this evening as we sound out the subconscious, navigate the nocturnal, and explore the farthest reaches of our experience. Coming at you from the back of an 86 Dodge Ram van on the rolling foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the great forest deep in the heart of the Kali Yuga. This is radio for the hauntological turn. And welcome back, Nightbirds. It's great to have you back, and it's great to be back. On this episode, I'm joined by Amanda Mariamne Radcliffe, who is Bishop Sophia in the French Gnostic Church. Amanda, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. And you?
Oh, I'm doing well. Real quick for the audience, if for anyone that's not familiar with you or your work, do you want to just real quick give a rundown of who you are and where they can find you?
Yeah, well, I guess I've been working in the field of Gnostic Bishop Episcopism since 2016 now. It's been 2016 since I was consecrated. And if people want to find me, they can find me on my website, which is amandamariamneradcliffe.com.
And I will put that in the notes so they can find it. One thing I did want to ask you, and it's something that I like to ask all my guests. I'm really interested in like, I'm interested in origins. I'm interested in like how you got to where you are now.
Mm-hmm.
Were you always interested in these topics?
I was, because I was brought up in a family where my dad was very interested in esotericism of different kinds, and my mom was a hereditary clairvoyant. And so in our family, we always had this kind of subject matter discussed, and we had books and things like that. And my dad's in different groups and orders, and so it was always there on the periphery when I was growing up. And being clairvoyant myself since I was a child, it just made sense for me to be interested in really the higher realms of human consciousness and human potential is the way I would describe it. So it was kind of inborn, and then it was also incorporated in my family very much. And then, like many people, I kind of decided to leave all of that alone and, find my own way. Didn't really want to go down the established route. So I tried many different things, many different paths, always being involved in art and theatre and music and things like that, different creative expressions. But then I think a path calls us, really, and I found a book when I was at university by a man called Arthur Gurdon. You probably heard me speak about him before. And his book was about the Cathars. And when I read that book, I had this sense of recognition, and something was inspired within me that I needed to find out more about who the Cathars were. But I never did. It just kind of stayed in the background of my mind for a long time. And then in 2016, after I'd been living in France for 3 years, because I'd been initiated in some esoteric groups in Paris, I was then invited to become ordained in the French Gnostic Church, and that's how it started for me. Yeah. And it was really it was 1 year after being initiated and consecrated that I went to Montsegur and started my experience of living there and everything that entailed.
So before we get into that, because I do want to hear some about that, do you want to get like, what are your first sort of memories or experiences of being clairvoyant?
Okay, I was 6 and I went with my mum to, it was a castle in Wales, and we were walking down the steps of this tower room, and down the circular steps. And I saw blood on the steps. I saw it as clear as if it was there. And I said to my mom, there's blood on the steps, and ran out of the tower room and wouldn't go back in because I could feel this fear, this terrible fear of something that happened there. And of course, my mom said it was just my imagination at the time. But as we went outside, the tour guide caught me. Like I said, I was about 6 and I was running, and the tour guide came and caught me. And she said, you know, what's wrong? So I told her. And she came over to my mom and said, well, actually, there was a murder in that place 700 years ago. So I had seen something real and that had leaked through into this timeline. And that happened a lot after that. That was one of the main kind of significant forms of clairvoyance that I had. Things from the past would leak through into the present moment. And then, of course, the usual things, visitations, ghosts, things like that. Precognitive dreams. So pretty much all of it. At quite a young age, I didn't really want it, though. That's the thing. You know, many of us don't I didn't really want it. But the trouble is, as we both know, I think, if you are called upon a certain path, if you resist, it just makes life harder, and then you get pushed, and then you get forced. And you must have heard of shaman sickness. In South Africa, it's called SAP. And they say that if you're called to be a shaman, or if you're called upon a spiritual path and you refuse and you stop listening and you continue to try to enforce your will upon your life, then your life will just get progressively worse and worse and worse and worse. In the beginning, they give you a little nudge, but then as time goes on, they push you harder and harder and harder until there is some kind of a crisis. And so the shaman sickness is not necessarily always needed. It's the fact that we don't listen. We are not listening to the fact that we've been called. And that was definitely what happened in my case numerous times, because of being willful and wanting to believe that I had free will and choice, and, you know, that I hadn't somehow been selected or already agreed in some way to walk this path and to do this mission.
I like the idea of already agreed. I ascribe to that.
Do you?
Yeah, you know, that I kind of use this, the idea of soul contracts,
Yeah.
that I have a work that I'm here to do.
Yes.
And yeah, do you have that experience too?
Oh, yes. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
No, go ahead.
I've tried to resist it so many times.
I want to
And
hear a
it's
little bit about that. I want to hear a little. Do you mind telling a story of when you tried to resist it?
not at all. I think it'd be really helpful for people to know. Soul contracts, yeah. Somehow, you know, those of us that are called in this area, we have agreed to something already somehow that we perhaps don't always know about or can't remember. But then when we look back at the synchronicities in our lives and how certain things have led to other things, it becomes apparent that there is a higher hand moving us forward in a certain direction. However, we can still, because we do still have the freedom to choose, we can still say no. And if we say no and we insist upon trying to impose our own will upon a situation, in my experience, it's been very painful. Yeah, I'll give you an example. So I was trying to buy a house in a particular place, and I kept pushing and pushing and pushing because I was so determined that that was the house that, you know, I wanted, and that's what it's going to be. And everything went against it. Every single thing went against it. But my willfulness, I just pushed and pushed and pushed until I exhausted it myself, and, you know, everything. If I just let go and said, okay, I don't know what's going to come next. I'm going to be in this empty space and I'm not going to try to force anything. I would have suffered a lot less and suffered a lot less financially, emotionally, energetically. But no, I had to be willful. This is what I wanted. And I wanted almost to experiment if I could live my life in an ordinary way, like ordinary people do. You know, you make a decision, okay, I'm going to buy this house, and it goes from A to B and so forth in a straight line, you know? That's how it works for ordinary people. However, in my case and in the case of people who have a specific mission, I think, it doesn't go in a linear progression at all. I'm sure you can relate to this.
I
So
relate. That's
that's
why
an
I'm
example.
smiling right now, because I relate to this 100%.
Yeah, that's an example of my own willfulness and my own stubbornness and refusal to accept that, you know, there's something else lining up for me. Which it did, except it wasn't what I imagined it to be. And another example I'll give you is when we made Color Out of Space, I had a particular plan in mind, and it certainly didn't involve, you know, making a Hollywood film. It was something else. And however, if I had willfully tried to force that other plan to happen, I wouldn't have gone to make Color Out of Space. So often we have these lulls where it seems as if nothing we are doing is working. And that's when we can become frustrated and think that we are abandoned by the spirit world as well. You know, I know that I do that often.
Same.
Yeah, because we want to feel we have some kind of control over our lives, or we can understand why something isn't happening. Like even that would help, even to understand why in the moment it's not happening would help. But we often don't get the information until after the event. As you'll know with synchronicity as well, like synchronicity can show us that we are on a certain path, but we often don't know the full story until we look back later.
Yeah, I have that experience too, and I relate to that a lot, because I can look back on. I often there's a story, I can't remember what prophet it is in the Old Testament, where, and I think it's like this happens a lot of the time with the prophets in the Old Testament, but there's a
Mm.
specific one that he's like, God tells him to go somewhere, and then he's like, no, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna go over here, and then like his donkey starts like talking to him and stuff. Like he just has all these crazy things, basically, until he surrenders and goes where he's supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shit show, right? And definitely in my life, I can see that. And I'm have always been kind of restless, especially staying put.
Yeah.
And I'm very much like, oh, things will make sense when I go over there. Like once I
Yeah.
go, right? And then
Right.
I go there and I'm like, oh, I'm still me.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
I brought myself with me, and I have the same, and you know, so it always kind of brings me back here after a while, which is interesting. It's like I'm just supposed to be here, and there's just I'm constantly in resistance to that because I'm trying to go be everywhere else. And my mind, you know, I can see that in my mind too, on like a microcosm, right?
Yeah. When you say be here, do you mean in Georgia or?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay.
I love the spirits here. Um, you know, it's interesting because I don't have like my ancestry is actually mostly from up north,
Ah.
like Michigan, and then like if you go further back, it's like New England, because I mean, both my sides of the family, I think, were have been here since the first colonists, you
Mm.
know, and so I don't know exactly what it is. That's just I think I just get along with the spirit
Yes.
population here. You know, like I love like I have my graveyards, I have my rivers, I have just I'm just I don't know. I feel like every time I try to get away, they pull me back, and like the harder I try to get away, the more violent, not violent, but like
Right.
almost like it ends up exploding, you know?
In what kind of ways?
So like whatever I'll be trying to do will not work out in a fantastic fashion.
Yes. Oh,
Um
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so like I tried to like move to Arizona and start a business with a buddy, and that was a debacle, and I ended up like with nothing but this van, like driving back here. And I got this van out of it though, so that's pretty cool.
Mhm.
Um, just things like that. The last time I started this was just not like recently, I started an over the road trucking career,
Mhm.
and which, has me away for just most of my time, 95% of the time I'm on the road.
Yeah.
And that didn't work out. That's not going to work out for me either. It's just not for me. Um, but here I am again. And I think that, so much to say, I really think that this goes on a lot in our society, especially like in the way that I don't even like the word modern because I don't think it's very modern and I don't even think it's very civilized. Um, but in the way that we've ordered our societies nowadays,
Yeah.
there's no pathway for initiation.
No.
And so the world is going to initiate in a kind of a chaotic way.
Absolutely agree. 110%. Yes. And that is the reason I went to France, because I could feel there was uh, a system of initiation in France still that had been very much neutered and neutralized in other European countries. Um, I definitely felt it was still there. It was an intuition I had. And I went looking for it really, you know, when I went in 2013, I was aware that there was something and that it was connected deeply with the land over there. Um, in England, unfortunately, in the UK, I really felt that the land had been drained, you know, in many places because it's quite a small country, the UK, and it
Yeah.
has a large population. And France is a much bigger country that has the same population, so you have a lot more space and there's more room for the land to breathe and there is more wilderness. Whereas in the UK, it's very compacted. And so I really felt that that was there. And I did find it, or it found me. It found me, actually, I would say. But I guess it was a two-way thing. So I was seeking, and that's why I found it. Had I refused to listen to the call, because I had the call in 2009 that I needed to go to France, which took me, several years to actually do it, then I wouldn't have known, that this esoteric current does exist in certain places still, but it is quite hard to find.
That's interesting that you talk about the land being drained. So one of the things, and I talk about this a lot, but I'm going to talk about it again. One of the things that I notice here is that a lot of these sacred sites, and I was telling you about some of the sacred sites in Georgia before we hit record,
Mm-hmm.
but so a lot of these Neolithic, or it could like older than that even, sacred sites um are owned by Georgia Power,
Oh,
which,
interesting.
yeah, very interesting to me because they're like power zones
Yes.
and they're owned by a power company. So it'll
Uh,
either be that, like one of them is a rock hawk. It's a hawk made of stones. They brought stones from all over the surrounding land and made a stone hawk on the ground. It's like an effigy, a hawk effigy, right?
incredible.
And it is basically surrounded by a barbed wire fence. Like it looks like the hawk is in jail. and you go up into this tower that's like a sniper tower, and you look down at this hawk, and it's like the vibe is, it's not good because you're basically, it just feels like a penal colony. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, they have encased it. They've encaged it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And
what happens, what I learned in France, one of the things that I learned through my many pilgrimages, is that whoever is the dominant power will do their best to almost enslave the spirits of the land in the service of whatever they're trying to create. And
yeah.
they do that in different ways, including geomantic techniques. So if you look in some of the ancient churches from the 11th and 12th century, for example, in France, you'll see in many of the architectural features which have been deliberately created by druids mostly, certain symbols which represent the particular elemental or being that they are actually recruiting in the service of the empowerment of the church. Yeah, it's a very interesting subject. I do write about that in my book, which I'm still writing.
Okay, that's one of the interesting topics to me. But go ahead. Sorry, you had more to
Yeah,
say.
just this idea, this concept that, and the Romans are the ones who started it. It began with the Romans. Yeah.
That's
But
what I was going to say.
yeah, right, right. Each place they conquered, instead of like throwing away the local god, they would incorporate it into their pantheon so that the local people would have no choice but to worship where they worshipped. So they would recruit their gods essentially, and then they would add them to their own pantheon. And yeah, it's the same
Yeah,
thing.
they would go to the land and call those spirits into statues, and then bring those statues back to
Yeah.
their pantheon. And that's called the. I always get it confused if it's invocatio or evocatio. It's one of those.
That's a
But
good question. I think isn't invoking when we call it in and evoking when we try to make it manifest outwards.
yeah, so I'm not sure which one it is. I know there's a name for it, but it's interesting because I can never find a lot of information on that when I look it up, but I always hear about it tangentially from people. And it's not surprising that I can't find a lot of information about that because I think they're currently using that to great effect. I personally think that kind of in a Philip K. Dick sort of way of the empire never ended, right?
Yes,
That the
completely.
empire is still doing that spell, but
Yes.
they're doing it against the individual on an individual level on
Yeah,
the inner terrain.
for sure. Well, certainly in the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, their statues that they make, even to repair one statue takes a minimum of 4 years because they have to keep putting it through certain rituals in every cycle of the year. And that's how they're created. They are created to ensoul the object, so they're not just a piece of art. And that goes back to the Babylonian tradition of the muse ritual, which is also Sumerian. And the same ritual was used in Egypt as well for ensouling statues. It's called the ritual of the opening of the mouth. And so there's a whole science, you could say, for the creation and ensoulment of statues using many different elements.
That's interesting because the in Buddhism they ensoul a statue of the Buddha by opening the eyes.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
They do it by opening the nose and the mouth. So you feed it and you offer it incense. You bathe it, feed it, offer it incense, things like that. And the things that the statues are fed have to be very specific. It's a very specific recipe. I know tamarind is in the recipe, but I can't remember what else right now. I think rosewater, tamarind. Can't remember. Yeah, it's easy enough to find. You can look it up and find the ritual.
Yeah, I'm
And
gonna have
it's
to try it.
Hmm?
I said I'm gonna have to try it.
Yeah, it's astrologically based as well. They have different and a lot around the cult of water. Water is very important as well. Of course. So yeah, I found in these churches, obviously having looked into Freemasonry as well, the geomancy that was being used in the very earliest churches was largely, like in Feng Shui in China as well, largely with the intention of utilizing the native forces that were already there. And that's also why they built upon ancient temples. You know, many of the churches that I'm speaking of were built upon Roman temples, usually dedicated to Venus or Minerva, including many that were later dedicated to Mary Magdalene. They started out as temples to Venus.
They did that here, especially in Mexico. The Catholic Church would build their churches on top of like Mayan and Aztec temples, and of course, in the process, they would do away with like a vast amount of information. It just makes me sick to think about it because it would, like just burning these beautiful codices.
They may be under the Vatican with a lot of other things.
Yeah, you know what? That's a good point, right?
Mm.
And the Vatican is a really interesting one, right? Because that site wasn't that a temple to oh, I'm losing it now. Do you know off the top of your head?
Is it Mithras?
Yeah, something like
Okay.
that. But there's like don't they have a piece of the same meteor?
Yes. Yes, you must have heard me speak about this in one of my other podcasts about the meteor that they have there. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the that's under the Vatican. The original meteor, which actually I have right here, ironically enough, this lady was based on. Can you see her? Yeah,
Yeah.
La Maranita, Our Lady of Montserrat. So she was originally based upon a meteor from Pessinus, and that stone was taken to Rome when Rome was under attack from Hannibal, as I think I've mentioned before. And yeah, the oracles said that if this meteor, the Black Goddess, was brought to Rome, then Hannibal would not win against the Romans. And the meteor was shaped in the shape of a woman. Now, whether that was naturally that way or whether it was carved that way, we don't know, because no one has seen it for many, many years, obviously. But it did get brought from Pessinus, and it had only ever been handled by women. It was a women's religious cult, and it was only permitted to be handled by women. So it was passed from priestess to priestess all the way to the ship. And then when it got on the ship, the priest was actually wearing female clothing in order to be able to receive it. That's what they insisted upon. And the legend says this is how come in the Catholic Church, the priests wear what looks like, women's clothing, essentially.
Oh, interesting.
Mm. Yeah, that's connected to the cult of Kybal as well. And I can't remember the name of her. The Galai, they were called the Galai. And the Galai also took care of a meteoric deity, which they called Kybal. So I think there have been several different manifestations of this particular meteoric goddess in different times and different places. Yeah.
And there's obviously some interesting symbolism there with, uh, a celestial being coming and being embedded into the earth.
Yeah.
And a lot of esoteric, very rich esoteric symbolism. But I wonder about, okay, so we've been talking about the Roman Empire taking these deities and incorporating them into their pantheon. And then, obviously we're talking about the Vatican doing the same thing. And obviously the Vatican is just a continuation of the Roman Empire, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's just in the name, like.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so they've got all the goods. And so I wonder about, we talk about syncretism, as if it's kind of like this, as almost as if it's just like, oh, it's naturally just what happens. But I wonder if there isn't sort of a more malign will behind that idea, right? Like, because I think there's part of me that wants to say like that the goddess will always shine through in whatever form she needs to take, right? And I think that's true.
Mhm.
But, you know, there's also this idea of like, okay, so they took the local forms of the goddess
Mhm.
and then put out kind of this uniform idea of their own,
Mhm.
Mary, the mother of Christ, right? And what do you think is going on there? What are your thoughts?
Um, Good question. I'm not quite sure. What do you think?
I think it's almost seems like to me it's a mirror of what's going on in a lot of areas where it's like the monolith, like a monolithic corporation
Mm.
taking over all these local entities and then putting out like making everything McDonald's is it's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And it seems to be like just an archonic impulse to
Mm.
administer everything top down. And like,
Mhm.
you know, if you vibe with the Catholic stuff, that's okay. I'm not saying that it's all bad because I think that the goodness shines through in everything, right? But like I do think that there are currents below it that I can kind of get closer to the main vein, if you will.
Mm. Yeah. That's really what I've been trying to do for the last 10 years. Not deliberately, but it's where I've been guided to get closer to that main vein that's still existing within the church in France, of course, not everywhere, but yes. Where we've got 11th and 10th century churches, 12th century churches, we still have some of that magic that's there and some of that original power that was closer to the source. After the Albigensian Crusade, at the time when the Cathars were murdered, everything changed. You'll see the architecture change, like the churches from the 11th and 12th centuries are much more rounded. You know, you don't have these big steeples. It wasn't so phallic and so aggressive. It was called the womb of God. The church was called the womb of God. And the idea was that these buildings were created to bring the spirit down later on, so it would be imminent with the people. So people could go to church and they could feel as if they were being bathed in the Holy Spirit. That's the idea. And after the Albigensian Crusade, we have a very aggressive Gothic architecture with these spires, you know, very sharp and very ornate, but in a very kind of aggressive way if you compare the two. And one was very feminine and one was very masculine, like extreme feminine and extreme masculine. And the first thing that they did after the Albigensian Crusade in Albi, which was one of the main areas of the Crusade, hence the name Albigens, you know, the Albigensian people were called Albigensians because of the city of Albi. And the very first thing that they did when they won is they burned down the previous church that was there with a load of Cathars in it. And then they built over it a reinforced, very militaristic church with an aggressive tower, you know, an aggressive steeple. And I
Exactly
didn't
what
know,
we've been talking about.
yeah, and I didn't know this when I went into this church for the first time. I thought, oh, you know, it'll be interesting, medieval church. As soon as I got in there, I had this vision of being on fire and I couldn't move. I was like rigid and like pulled to the spot. I felt like I was on fire. And I said to my partner, I need to get out of here. I couldn't stand it. And I went outside, came back in the same spot, had the same experience. And it was only later on that I found out what had actually happened, that they had burned the pre-existing Cathars in that spot.
Wow.
So it's another example of how, you know, things from the past can filter through to those of us who are kind of tuned that way. So yeah, I would say the architecture, you can see the change. So the church, the early church, is very, very different than what came later. When they won, they didn't only, you know, win an ideological war, they won a great deal of money, a great deal of land that they just took from the nobles that supported the Cathars. And in Montségur, you know, it was 200 years before anyone went anywhere near the mountain again, because the trauma of what happened there was so bad. And they wouldn't let anyone live there. Nobody wanted to live there. And that was a local who told me that story, that nobody wanted to be, you know, on the Holy Mountain, even though it was their Holy Mountain, because they just felt like it was a giant graveyard, you know. So the impact of the Albigensian Crusade can't be underestimated, because the torture techniques that they developed then were the same ones later used at the witch trials, and the exact same behavior. It started there, and they were so deeply threatened by the fact that the local noble families were giving their money and their land to the Cathars, not to the Catholic Church. And having read the Inquisition records and stories of different priests at the time who were involved in all of this, one of the most grueling things that I read was from a priest who wrote in extreme detail all the things that they'd stolen, you know, from the different places that they'd raided and had all the inhabitants killed. So however much in wine, however much in oil, however much in gold, you know, some priest had laboriously written all of this down. And reading that, I had realized it was not only about faith, you know, it's not only about ideology, it was also about resources and money and power. Same as with the Knights Templar, of course. Anything that sought to indirectly, not even deliberately, but anything that threatened to take away the power base of the Catholic Church, Church of Rome, was considered to be a diabolical threat. And anyone involved in that could be killed in whatever reprehensible ways they deemed, you know, deemed necessary. It didn't matter. And what they did during the Albigensian Crusade was extremely brutal. They did things like cut people's noses off, cut people's ears off, gouge their eyes out, and then left them to wander with one person with one eye leading them out of the town. That was before they started out and out killing them. So, you know, there was a you could say it was a terrorist war in the beginning. It was terrorism. So they would go, they would make an example of these people. They wouldn't kill them, but they would maim them and disfigure them, so that any other Cathar or any of the noble families supporting the Cathars could see this and think, we don't want this to happen to us and to our families. But the thing about the Cathars that makes them so unique is the fact that it didn't stop them. Their faith was so strong that they refused to be cowed into submission. And the only reason that Montségur fell in the first place was someone betrayed it from the inside, because Montségur was impenetrable. And it had 7 springs, and so, you know, it never run out of water. They'd lived up there for long enough, they knew how to survive, but someone betrayed from inside and let the war dogs in. Otherwise, they would never have gotten over the firmaments. And that, unfortunately, is a common story in the Cathar story. People were scared, they wanted to protect themselves and their interests, and so they didn't think twice about betraying their fellow man.
Can you give just a quick run? And I know it's not easy to do a quick one, but can you give a rundown for anyone that doesn't know who the Cathars were?
Yeah, so you could say the Cathars were a religious group. They were based mainly in the south of France from the 10th century onwards. The last Cathar, DM Ballyfast, was executed in 1321. And before he died, he said that in 700 years, the good men and women shall return. So he gave a prophecy about reincarnation, because Cathars believed very strongly in reincarnation or transmigration of souls, which originally was part of Christianity. That was only taken out by Constantine when he started to, do what he did. But originally reincarnation was a part of Christianity. It wasn't what it is now, where everyone, says you go to heaven, that's it, you give up on life, you mess it up, you go to heaven, you go to hell. Hell wasn't even part of the original doctrine, as you probably know. So there's a great deal that has been added for social control, which was not in the original teachings at all. So the Cathars, we are not quite sure where they emerged, but they do seem to have similarities to the Mandaeans and people like that, so early Gnostics, essentially, of different faiths, with very similar practices and similar beliefs. And they seem to be very similar also to the early Nazarenes, who were part of, Jesus's actual sect that he is said to belong to. So you could say kind of mystical Judaism. So it's not quite sure exactly from where they emerged, but there are also traces of Sufi practices within Cathars, we believe, in Buddhist practices. And their most important difference when it comes to the Catholic Church is that they believed in simplicity. They did not believe that Christ wanted people to be ostentatious in the church. So they disagreed hugely with the amount of wealth and corruption that the Catholic Church had amassed, and they were saying that that was not true. They also believed that the Old Testament was the work of the demiurge, that Jehovah was the demiurge, and they only ever used the New Testament and I can't even say the word, apocryphal Gospels. And there is knowledge that they had a book, they had their own holy book, the Book of Love, but unfortunately that was either taken or burned. They had their own holy book with their own teachings in it. And they were pacifists, and they lived very simply, they dressed very simply, their rituals were very simple, and they ordained women, and women were very revered in Cathar culture. And that is another reason why they were despised by the Catholics, of course, by the Roman Church, because they were giving women not only equal power to men, but more power, in fact. And so the idea of the cult of Mary actually began with Cathars, has been discovered since. The idea of courtly love began with the Cathars as well, and the Sufis, which we believe brought, a lot of that in, because that region had a lot of Sufis, had a lot of mystical Jews, and the Cathars. So they were all at that time cross-fertilizing, culturally, ideologically, because there was no reason why they should not. And the noble families who lived there were welcoming these people from different cultures into their chateaus, and they were having intellectual debates and sharing knowledge, sharing gnosis. And these noble families, they had a lot of money, a lot of influence, and so to be bringing these people in and propagating their ideas and defending them, they were a very big threat to the Catholic Church, as you can imagine. They had to be gotten rid of, and they were. So, and the noble families from that region who were involved with Catharism as well were not strictly French. They were not strictly Occitan. A lot of them had Nordic ancestry. So a lot of them came in with the Norman conquest. So they were not your average local person at all. So you could say they were involved in the Aryan belief system prior to Catharism, which is not, not what the Nazis tried to make it into. There was another belief system of Gnostic Christianity called Arianism in the past. So the Cathars, I think what they really were is they were a group, a bit like Buddhists, who wherever they passed through, they kind of gathered the flavor of that region. So in the way we've got Tibetan Buddhism, we've got different, flavors of Buddhism in different countries. I think it was the same for the Cathars, really.
So you mentioned the Templars. What is the connection between the Cathars and the Templars? Because I don't even know that I knew there was one, but I had this feeling that there would be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there is, and it's controversial because not a lot of people talk about it. However, because I've been living in the region for so long, I've been visiting different sites and speaking to locals who still have hereditary family knowledge, things that have been passed down, and looking in the records, and the records definitely do say that the Knights Templar did try to protect Cathars at various times. Yeah. Of
Very
course,
cool.
the Order of the Temple, when it was founded, it had a particular purpose. However, in that region of France, they're saying that it had a different purpose than what it was supposedly created for, and that was to protect the descendants of the bloodline of Christ and Magdalene, in fact, who were in that region, who were in that part of France. And, the Cathars also believed that some of the Cathars, not all, but, that they were descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And when they were murdered in another church in, I can't remember the name of the city now. Not Albi, but Béziers. About 20,000 of them were murdered in one day. And they were locked inside the Church of Mary Magdalene that used to exist there. And before they were set on fire, apparently the priest said to them, "Go and be with your foremother." And they also did this to them on Mary Magdalene feast day, which is the 22nd of July. So, they knew what they were doing. And that was the same massacre during which they were told, when a soldier said, "How do you know who's Catholic and who's Cathar?" One of the priests said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." So in other words, they didn't care if they were killing Catholics as well as Cathars. They didn't care. That is the amount of hatred and fear that they had for the Cathars, that they were willing to kill their own people as well. So the Templars were said to have been created to protect pilgrims on the route to the Holy Land, and to hold on to their money and their valuables. But there was a very important Templar commandery in Occitania, which had been visited by the king himself long before the king then, well, it was the king's son at the time, then decided that, the Knights Templar had to go. I would say that, from my own research, then yes, there is a connection there. But before they had the Knights Templar, they had a group of knights who were called the Fadets, and the Fadets were the knights of the villages and towns where the Cathars had been given refuge by the noble families. And they were usually noble men themselves. And they often practiced the practices of the courts of love, which were also in that area. Boisvert, especially the Chateau of Boisvert, being one of the main seats of the courts of love. And the courts of love were a knightly order in which the lady, in her physical form, but also her spiritual form, was really the head of the order of the courts of love. And there were 3 different levels of initiation within the courts of love as well. And we believe there was a kind of European form of Tantra that was being practiced in these courts as well, especially in the sense of union between the masculine and the feminine being considered to be a spiritual art form, as opposed to, the usual arranged marriages that were common of that day. And that is the reason why we had the troubadours and their songs and poems about ladies that they couldn't be with. It was all coded. It was all coded about what was really going on, see, what was really being taught. And so when the Cathar Albigensian Crusade ended, one of the first things that the Catholics did was introduce the Rosary and introduce the cult of Our Lady, because the Cathars already had the cult of the Lady, but it was based upon a real spiritual being, a real spiritual encounter. And we believe the reason why so many of the Cathars in Montsegur chose to die rather than camp in March 1244 was because they had a real genuine encounter with the Lady on the mountain. Even soldiers were converting to Catharism, you know, that had just gone up there to fight. They were converting to Catharism, and Catholics themselves, on meeting the Cathars just before the end of the crusade, where everyone was banned, said they had never met spiritual and pious people, and they could find them and their spirituality beyond reproach.
There's so many questions I want to ask about this. I'm trying to figure out where to go. I do want to talk about the lady, the Dame Blanche, the white lady.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who is she? I know that's a big question.
Very big question. Well, you know about my encounters with her, I guess, from my previous podcasts that I've done.
Yeah, but I do, but I don't know if all my listeners do.
No, probably not.
Some of them probably do.
Maybe. So who is she? Good question. I don't know. Do you know about Chris Bledsoe?
You know, it's really interesting that you mentioned this, because I started listening to an interview with Chris Bledsoe 2 nights ago.
Okay.
Which is the night before we were previously. Of course, my audio goes out right when we mention this. This is really interesting.
It does not surprise me one iota.
So I put on a Chris Bledsoe interview, not knowing that that was a topic of his at all. I just knew he was into the UFO stuff, and I knew that he was communicating with the being that he refers to as Hathor. I had heard that like a long time ago and wasn't even really sure what was going on there. So I put it on the night before last, which is the night before we were originally scheduled to record, and all of a sudden he starts talking about the white lady, and I'm like, oh, this is no coincidence at all.
No, it's not. So I had my encounter with the lady in April 2016 in a place called Boisvert in France. I went on pilgrimage to this 12th century, well, actually 11th century church, because they had a Black Madonna there. And as you know, I have a particular fondness for the Black Madonna. And I wanted to go as part of a group of women who were praying at different sacred sites around the world at the same time for 200 different people. This was a prayer pilgrimage organized by a friend of mine called Rayling Abbott, and she'd been doing it for 30 years. And each time she did this, and different women prayed in different places, really miraculous things would happen for the people being prayed for. So it was something she'd been doing once a year for 30 years, and she invited me to be part of this. And so I went to this place called Boisvert, which is a volcanic region in the Auvergne, which has the highest volume of Black Madonnas in the whole of France, and prayed at this church at night, because it was a sanctuary church, and so it's always open 24 hours a day, and went to my hotel room directly opposite the church. The church is in the center of the town, and there's like a circle around it. And so my hotel was on one side of the church, and then shops and things were all around it, you know. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up from a dream about a very bright white light in the room. And when I opened my eyes, it was actually really there. And I watched as it, so this is 3 a.m. and I watched as it took the shape of a lady in front of me. It was like it was pulling from the light somehow. it was coagulating from light, and it was no mere mirage or phantom or even a spirit. It was something else. And I just watched as she took shape, and she had no face. She was clearly wearing a veil of some kind and hovering 3 feet above the ground. And she had a red light in the center of her chest where her heart would be, that was scintillating. And then she spoke to me. Now, I was absolutely terrified, I think you can imagine. I was wide awake, the adrenaline was flowing all the way through my body, you know. It's definitely not sleep, this is no dream. And yeah, and then she spoke and she said to me, "You called me, so what do you want?" Oh, that's no, sorry. The first thing she said was, people think they're coming here to see the Black Madonna, but this is what I really look like. You called me, so what do you want? And I was like terrified. Yeah, and that actually the installmental statue is what we were talking about before. Yeah. And so I could not think, let alone formulate a sentence. I couldn't respond. I was under my duvet like this, you know, and couldn't think. And so she scanned me. This is the really weird part about this experience. She extended like a filament of light from the center of her body and just scanned up and down the center of my body for like hours and hours and hours. And then as dawn was approaching, I was not paralyzed. It was not like I had paralysis or anything, but I was in a kind of trance-like state. And I didn't want to move. I didn't want to break this connection with whatever was happening. It felt really important somehow. And it wouldn't have even entered into my mind to try and stop it. You know, I wasn't scared, like by that time, somehow I was not scared. And then at the end of scanning me, this is where it gets really weird. She said, well, as if that's not weird enough, she said, what you want is the truth, and the truth you shall have. And if you want to know the truth about your boyfriend, look at his phone. And I said, no, like I kind of came out of my trance and said, no. And she then just floated backwards through the window. I think she must have come in through the window somehow, but I was asleep at the time. And then because the light seemed to be coming from that direction when I woke up from the window. And then she just floated backwards out through the window as I watched. And my then boyfriend came to pick me up actually later on, and I told him what had happened. And I said, so why would she ask me to look at your phone? You know, what are you hiding, kind of thing. And he confessed that at the time he was still in touch with his ex, and he said he wasn't, and things like that, you know. It was all very mundane stuff. But just before we left Boisvert, I went to buy a knife at a shop which is on the same kind of ley line, you could say, from where my hotel room was, but on the opposite side of the church. And we went into this shop, and I spoke to the owner, who was a guy, maybe 35, something like that, and asked him in French, you know, do you know of anyone who's ever had like any weird experiences here, like maybe connected to the church or anything? Because I just had this experience, and I wanted to know if this was, you know, something that happened to anyone else, or if there were any stories of ghosts or, you know, anything, because I was very confused. And he said, yes, me. And he went on to say that almost a year to the day before he decided he was going to commit suicide, his wife and children had left, and he felt like he had no reason to go on. And he'd gone to the church to pray at the statue of the Black Madonna, because he'd lived in Boisvert all of his life, even though he was no longer religious. And he decided he was going to do it the next day. And that night, almost the same thing happened to him as happened to me. 3 a.m., woken up by a bright white light from a dream of a bright white light, opened his eyes, and it was in the room. In his case, he leapt out of bed and looked out the window, because it seemed like we both said, like I said, that it was coming from outside. And he saw it was not coming from outside, and terrified, he ran back into bed. And then saw the light take the shape of a woman. And again, no face, veiled, 3 feet above the ground. Well, above, yeah. And 3 a.m. in the morning as well. And so please excuse the strange singing outside. I'm in Glastonbury at the moment, so this happened all the time.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So it's a bit distracting, but yes. I don't know what's going on up there. But so yeah, he had almost an identical experience anyway, in which he was then told by her, do not do what you were thinking of doing. If you do, it's going to destroy your wife and your children's lives, and you are not supposed to die now. And she then went on to tell him something quite interesting, which was that the reason his wife had left was because this guy was very psychic, but had shut it down since childhood. And in doing that, he'd shut down all of his emotions as well, you know, to try to be a man. So he like shut down everything. And so his wife couldn't connect with him emotionally. And that's why she'd gone. And interestingly, the lady said she's not coming back, you know, but you will have a friendship. She's not coming back because she's not meant to. You're meant to be doing other things. And so that was his experience. So for me, I think you can imagine, like, having had an encounter like that in the first place, which is so intense, to then meet a man who had almost the exact same encounter in almost the same place, just directly opposite my hotel, a year before almost. It just blew me away, you know. And then for years, I sought to find an explanation. I sought to understand what it was. He believed it was the Virgin Mary after that, because it, you know, had come from the church. I didn't really feel that it was the Virgin Mary, because it felt extremely, she rather felt extremely neutral. You know, she felt extremely neutral. She didn't feel like she belonged to any particular religion, actually, to me personally. And so that was in 2016. And by 2017, I connected with Richard Stanley, who was the director of Colour Out of Space, because of my job at the time, which was to research for a web TV channel in Paris that wanted to have speakers about Cathars and different esoteric subjects. And he was recommended to me that we contact him for an interview. So the first conversation Richard and I had, however, once we'd stopped talking about the Cathars, was about the White Lady, because he had an encounter with her 10 years before with a witness on Montsegur, and it was the almost exact same type of situation, except he wasn't sleeping. He, you know, they walked up the mountain. It was quite late at night. It was a full moon, and there she was, and they both saw her. And in his case, he changed his life completely, sold everything he owned in England, and moved to be in Montsegur because he wanted to have that experience again. He wanted to be close to that possibility. And then he became an expert in the history of the Cathars through living there and through, you know, this story. So it was thanks to Richard that I became aware that what I had seen, or rather encountered, because it was a visitation, it was not simply, you know, it was an encounter. It's very similar to what happened with the visitations that people had with the cult of Mary, you know, Lord and Fatima and so on. It was very, very similar. So that helped me. And then Richard also told me that there had been a very ancient knowing and understanding of this being in the south of France since Neolithic times. And that was the reason why one of the most ancient sculptures ever made is of a white woman's head, you know, made out of ivory, an ivory tusk, in that region. And so he was of the impression that this being had been making herself known in that region for a very long time.
And one of the first things I thought of when I heard that story was also the idea of the fairy queen, the queen of the fae,
Yes,
that shows up
absolutely.
the same way, right? And pretty close geographically too.
Yes, that's right.
And and you can talk about these sorts of sightings that happen all over the world. The Virgin of Guadalupe, the
Mhm.
just the list goes on and on. And so it has me. That's the reason I ask who is she, because it seems like she's, and to me it's the world soul, right? She is the soul of the world. Um, and one of the things, so you told that story, I heard it years ago,
Mhm.
and then I started praying to her.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that she impressed on me was, and this, I don't try to tell anyone universal truth. This is a personal thing, but I think it can possibly apply. She said, I'm able, basically, like, in so many words, like, I'm able to show up in these specific places, but soon I'll be able to show up everywhere. And this
Yeah,
is what's happening right now, and this is like what we are called to be a part of.
absolutely. I do believe that because the way having met different people, and I've been speaking with Chris Bledsoe, just to add that, that's the reason that I mentioned it. And he has confirmed that in his opinion, we have encountered the same being. Um, but it's like different iterations thereof, and it's like I said about the Cathars, they take on the flavor of wherever they pass through. I think it's the same with the lady, she takes on a different flavor as well wherever she's found. The way I see it is it's almost like she has a root system. And this is really odd considering she's a cosmic being, but it's almost like she has a root system under the earth. And so she pops up in different places where there's like a portal location. But the root is still there, and that root connects her to every single other manifestation.
Yeah, I like that. I always think of it as a hand, but it's the
Mhm.
same idea, right?
Mhm.
Like, this finger is a discrete expression. It's a finger, but it is part of the hand. Like,
Yeah.
and so where that hand kind of breaches, and for people that can't see this, I'm doing a lot of hand gestures, but where the fingers breach through reality, it might seem as if they're different manifestations because I can't see past the veil to where they're all joined at
Yeah.
the arm.
Mhm.
And that's, maybe that's just a how we, are limited by three dimensions. Um, you know, possibly we won't be soon, but depending on your opinions of that.
Yeah,
Um,
it makes sense to me how you described it, because that is literally when I tuned in and tried to understand how these different manifestations happen in different locations, and yet they all seem to be so similar. Um, that was what I was shown, that there's a hidden connector
I like
that
the
we could.
root.
Mm,
I like the root system a lot
mm,
because I've been kind of engaging with her more chthonic aspects lately.
mm.
Um, I just last year begun a practice with Hecate.
I thought you may say that when you mentioned the word soul. Mhm.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Mm,
And I didn't expect really to see her there. And that's just a limit of my knowing, right? But like, I didn't expect that. And then when I dove into that, because I had a dream where I went to a abandoned temple. This was last year, towards the end of the year,
mm,
and I was on the road, and I had a dream where I went into this abandoned temple that was overgrown in a forest, and I knew it was a temple to Hecate, and I saw this brazier and I lit it, and the brazier was in the form of an owl, and the owl's eyes shone, like, lit up, and it became visible from afar. And in the dream, I just knew it was a temple to Hecate. She didn't particularly show up. But ever since then, I've been kind of just on that ride, basically. You know, and she, but like I said, I didn't expect that to connect, I guess, is what I'm saying. And the more I get to know Hecate, the more I'm like, oh, there you are. You
You
know?
could say Hecate as an embodiment of the Black Goddess, the Black Madonna.
Right. And that's, yes, exactly.
Yeah. And in Occitania, as I found out through Richard, there is a tradition that says first you get the Black Madonna, then you get the White Lady. And in his
Oh,
and mine, we both had individual encounters with this kind of Masonic deity before we had our encounters with the White Lady. So in our case, it kind of came that way around first, and then we found out there's a tradition of that there also, which is, you know, why the Cathars were said to have worshipped images of the Black Madonna. Because fundamentally she is the, as you say, the world soul, and also the primordial force, you know, the Shakti, out of which we all come and to which we will return. So she is the subatomic realm, you know, and it's as if the White Lady is somehow twinned with her, you know, they're like two sides of the same coin, opposites,
yeah.
but two sides of the same coin.
I think so. And I think it mirrors, because there's a phrase, and I think I can't remember where I exactly encountered this. It's a quote, and I'm probably going to misquote it, but oh well. That is, the Prince of Darkness and the Lord of Light, or the Prince of Darkness is but a different aspect of the Lord of Light. And I think it works with the goddess too. I think that's just kind of the nature of reality, right? That we experience these aspects, and so we say, oh, and I think this is part of what makes the dance of this incarnation so beautiful, is that my relationship with these aspects actually draws them into fullness and draws them into a fuller incarnation. Like you're talking about how every area she appears, she's interpreted differently, and she's kind of flowing through the spirits of the land and taking on a different manifestation. Like, I think this is one of the amazing things that we're able to do as incarnate beings, is to draw forth different manifestations.
Yes. Yeah.
And just as I'm kind of just as, you know, because I think we're the same way personally. This is like how I see it, is that, you know, we're all shards of the Godhead, right? We're all shards of that pleroma. We have the spark of light within us. So there is a level in which we're all one, but there is also this very real plane in which we are different. And since we're different, we get to dance.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And in our Gnostic tradition, you know, we fully believe that, and we fully honor that. We are not of the opinion that we should be seeking union with the Godhead, and as one of my teachers called it, turning into Jello with the Godhead, you know.
I like it.
All merge into one like massive Jello. No, it's not like that. And if you believe in reincarnation, then how can that be the case? You know, if every soul has a particular set of experiences to go through, then individuality is really important. And it's why I've never got along with any of the traditions, including of the Gnostic type, who preach against that. And the Cathars didn't preach against that. There is a problem in spirituality where we are encouraged to so-called give up our ego. When we look more deeply into that, give up our ego to who and for what purpose?
Right.
You often find that people, you know, get a new name, they give away all their money, they do whatever they're told. But who does it serve? Does it really serve them, or is it serving the people running those groups?
Right.
So,
I like to think of it more as, and I'm with you, and I used to, I think, seek annihilation of the ego.
Hmm.
I just think maybe it's a stage of development. I don't know, but like to me, I was like, oh, that's the problem, right? Ego. If I just get rid of ego, I'll be fine. And
Yeah.
then I find out, oh wait, I can't. Like it is literally the boat that I'm in.
We can't. And, I think even with addiction, that's often an attempt to annihilate the ego, to
Right.
annihilate it, to not feel what we feel, know what we know, need what we need, to somehow transcend in such a way. Aldous Huxley talks about this in his preface to the book, The Devils of Loudun. And he says that humanity is always geared towards transcendence of some kind. It's whether we go upwards with it or we go downwards with it. And, his description of the downwards transcendence is things, even believe it or not, like fascism and groupthink. That's still a way of like how when people join a herd, he calls it herd consciousness, they can totally lose their own sense of identity, and they can do things, really terrible things that they would not do if they were just an independent person on the street. And it's the same in that famous Milgram experiment where, the people were in the prison and they were in a group situation with each person, encouraging the other. It's amazing what people will do because they are seeking that self-transcendence unconsciously. At least with addictions, people do it consciously. They may not be aware of why, but they're kind of consciously doing it. It's a conscious decision to seek an escape from the self. And religion and Gnosticism and things like that can offer the same thing, but in a different way.
I think of it like nowadays I see it more of an alignment. Like
Yeah.
my ego can be aligned with many things. It's always going to be aligned with something.
Yep.
As long as I'm incarnate, I just think it's kind of part and parcel to being in a body, right? It's part of the body. And um I can align it with different things, and that's the cool thing, is that I have a choice. And I find that when my ego is aligned with my highest good, with my highest self, and that's not obviously, like, that's a process, right? Like I'm never going to be perfect. Well, maybe, I don't know, but I currently I'm not.
Yeah.
And
I was having a conversation with someone the other day who practices Chinese medicine, and he was saying that in their way of looking at things, we have a true self and a false self. And I think that's very similar to the Gnostic way of looking at things. We talk about removing the 7 veils so that we can see who we really are and be who we really are and be in that alignment, which happens very much by itself. Like often it's all about getting out of our own way in the Gnostic path. It really
yeah,
is more about that than anything else. Like, okay, what in my, and so the true self, according to this chap I was talking to, is who we are when we are born. We are a baby. That is our blueprint. And then that has a particular path that's going to develop upon, like an acorn growing from an oak. But then what we, no, an oak growing from an acorn. And then what we get though is we get conditioning, and we get fears coming in, and we get this and that coming in, education, so on. And that's the false self. That is the person that we have to be in order to fit in and survive in the society we live in. And that can be very, very damaging to the true self, which has its own God-given or spirit-given path of development. And then if that gets restricted and constricted, it's like a plant growing with weeds all around it. If those weeds are like parasitic, they start to suffocate that plant, and it can't be what it was meant to be. It will become all gnarled and twisted. It may still live, but it won't ever fulfill its potential to grow. And I think it's like that with us as human beings. The influences that we are, that we accumulate, actually, we accumulate a lot of influences from the outside. And if we don't have an awakening, those influences become who we are, and that's the ego, that is the collection of the false selves. I say selves because we have many different ones, don't we? We have the one that used to go to church, the one that used to go down to the nightclub, the one that's taking drugs, the one that's doing, you know, all of these different selves. They're all false. They're all like shells that we put on in order to survive the world that we live in. Whereas the true self is always there underneath, and that is what we are drawn to try to find and to express within the Gnostic path. And my job and the work that I do with people is to help them to find that, to recognize what that feels like. And that is the self that we need to have lined, like you're saying. That is the part of us that we need to have lined. If we don't even know what that feels like, we can't align it, can we? We're just kind of acting on impulse and not being in that truth.
Yeah, very beautifully put. Yeah, I call it the flame imperishable.
That's lovely.
And the thing is, though, I can I can kind of shut myself off from the experience of it. Like, it can't ever die, but I can totally, like you said, get in my own way and block myself from it. But the interesting thing is, no one can actually do that to me. I have to do it to myself, and they can convince me to do it. And so people talk about, like, you know, the Matrix and the archons and stuff, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it gets very scary. But when I realize is that I'm the one with all the power, they have just convinced me that they have the power, and therefore, in practice, they do, until I claim my power back, and they can't do anything. I shut them out.
Absolutely. 100% agree. I think that is perfectly put.
I do want to talk about what you were going back. We went on a great tangent, but talking about Chris. You've been talking to Chris Bledsoe, you said,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things that he stuck out, that he was saying that the white lady told him, and it's, in my experience, seems to be the case. You can see it happening in people's lives, but also on in the world's psyche, whatever
Mm-hmm.
you want to call it. You know, the spiritus mundi, the
Yeah.
anima mundi, whatever you want to call it, the zeitgeist, um, is that she is rising. The divine feminine is rising.
Yes. Mm.
Where are we in that process? Because he talks about there will be troubles, and it seems like we're in that troubles period, right?
I mean, one of the predictions she gave to him is that it's going to continue like this, I think, till 2026. So we're not out of the woods yet.
Yeah.
And this divine feminine rising has been foreseen in my Gnostic school of thought as well, like it was predicted in the 18th, 19th century. And they said that this era that was coming from 1880 onwards, they were calling, well, 1875 really, they were calling it the era of Gnosis restored, otherwise known as the era of the lady and the era of love. And so they were saying that this time was coming. And that's why Jules Dornel, who recreated the French Gnostic Church in 1880, I think it was told that we need to bring the feminine back into the church. And so that was the reason why he was ordaining women, even though it was so controversial at that time, can you imagine? But he was doing it anyway. And Eugene Vintress, another one of the people in my lineage, he was a controversial figure, but he was also ordaining women and working with women in a spiritual way. So this kind of this thread, which Chris and his encounters with the lady is part of, has been foreseen for a long time. And if people misunderstand, I think, what the divine feminine really is and what it really means, it's not about women becoming empowered or setting themselves up as priestesses of imaginary religions. You know, it's not about that. That is a part of it for some people, but it is a much greater subject than how it manifests. I think you know what I mean with your work with Hecate and the world soul. I think you understand what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I think it is a different, like a new stage of evolution in the human being. And that comes with everything that you might think that comes with. That comes with perhaps like a shift in the very nature of reality
Yes.
as we co-create it.
Yes. Well, look what's happening with the Congress reports, the disclosure movement.
Right.
You know, Chris Bledsoe came into my awareness through a friend who'd been saying to me for a long, long time, your encounter is the same as this man who's got something to do with UFOs. And I was saying, I don't want to know. I don't want to know about UFOs. I'm not interested in UFOs. This is nothing to do with UFOs. This is a spirit being. This is a deity. This is not anything to do with UFOs. And I was just so anti all of that completely and very resistant to it. Despite having seen a few things myself that don't make any sense, I did not want to know. And then I found myself having this conversation with Chris Bledsoe and him, you know, our encounters, 3 a.m., 3 feet off the ground. I mean, so many of the things that we experience are almost identical. And, you know, I've encountered the lady now 6 different times. So it's not just a one-off. And I'm talking here in physical form, like he did. It's not simply a vision. And it was, I think, I'm not sure if it was through Chris or through the person that introduced me to Chris, but then I made contact with Diana Pasulka. You probably heard of her as well.
Oh yeah,
So
I'm a fan of her work.
Yeah. So I've been having quite a few conversations with Diana, and I appeared on a conference that she did last year with Whitley Strieber and John Ramirez talking about all of these things. You know, Diana and Chris, they're aware that this is a very, very real phenomenon we're talking about here. And one of the things that came to my attention, you know about Ingo Swann?
I love his stuff. I'm an Ingo Swann fan too. Yeah.
Me too, big fan of his work. Well, he's written a book called The 21 Apparitions of Mary, which you've probably seen.
Yeah, I actually haven't read it, but I know of it.
Yeah.
I need to read it, I guess.
Yeah. And in the preface of that book, one of the things that he said that stayed with me a lot is that when we had the apparitions at Lourdes and Fatima and so on, they came about at a time of great social change and great unrest, and a lot of people died. You know, we had famines, we had plagues, we had all kinds of things after those apparitions and the warnings that they gave happened. And so a lot of the things that the girls were told did actually come to pass. And there's a lot of things that you know that have never been revealed yet. And it's the same with Chris. You know, he has got things that he can't yet share publicly. And what I find interesting is how the lady seems to manifest when we are at the edge of a real crisis point and real change in the world, you know, and a lot of people are going to suffer. And I think the reason she comes, for me personally, is to show us that we are not alone, that this is not all that there is, that this physical body is not all that there is, you know, that there is another aspect to life, which is not just about the material world, making money, you know, fulfilling our egos, surviving. There's something much, much bigger that some of us are made to become a kind of reminder of, you know. And I feel that my job when I speak about the lady is to tell this to people: you're not alone. This is not it. You know, even if you can't feel the connection of the spirit right now, it's there, like that root system, it's there. We just need to remember that we can tap into this, and it is our birthright, it's part of who we are. And she has great compassion for us, even though her powers are limited. That's the other thing I've realized. She's not omnipotent. Her powers are limited because there are counter forces to her existence. I know that sounds really far out, but it's the truth, you know?
It's not. I don't think it's too far out for what we do here. Like my listeners will be, yeah, okay, yeah, we're with it. Yeah,
Good. It just sounds like very like Game of Thrones or something, but you know,
it is though. I think it is. I think like reality is a lot more like Lord of the Rings than we are willing to admit.
yeah, exactly. That is literally how it is. And you know, to have found myself like a part of the story is really strange. And it was really speaking with Chris Bledsoe and listening to him talk about his encounters and how when he met the lady, he was broken. You probably know this. He was very ill. I think it was Crohn's disease that he had, Crohn's disease. And he was, you know, on his knees, physically very, very ill, having loads and loads of problems because he had spoken out about the orbs that were on his property. And he'd been ripped off or taken advantage of by, I don't know who, some TV channel. His children were being bullied at school because of him being the UFO guy. And he was broken. He was completely broken, down on his knees. And that was when she appeared to him and told him, tell the world about me. Tell the world that what's coming out about UFOs and the disclosure. I mean, she didn't say that, but what's coming out about UFOs, it's not all evil. Because she said to him, as you'll know, that there was going to be a kind of media disinformation to portray whatever was coming as only evil, as only bad. And one of the things he really impressed upon me about was that that is not the case. You know, I've had people say to me, how do you know the lady's not evil? How do you know she's not gonna like try and possess you and like use you to like kill people or eat your brains or something, you know? And I just know. And it's the same with Chris. Like if you listen to Chris speak, you can just hear it in his voice, can't you? Like that he is in resonance with something of great compassion, of great love. And not only that, but he is respected by the alphabet agencies in your country. You know, they know that he is not lying. He's not making this up. So I think when we speak about the divine feminine, this is what we're really talking about here. We're talking about, like you said, a change in consciousness, in the awareness that there is something more. And she's not just a fairy, you know, she's a cosmic being, essentially, that is making herself known in the same way as these orbs and these other beings are making themselves known at this time.
Well, and I think another point that you're making is that she is able to bring about practical change in my life. I shared with you before we recorded that my like rock bottom moment, like what the thing that brought me out of that was I prayed to Sophia to save me. And ever since that moment, I have not had a drink or a drug, and I haven't even needed it. I haven't had a craving. Like it hasn't been a fight. I just stopped fighting, and the mother was there to catch me. And I didn't see her, but I can see the effect in my life, and I can only hope that one day I will see her. But I don't have, like, personally, the thing about the mother is that she inspires a devotion that is so different than because I work with some other deities too, and mostly like masculine ones that are like, it's a different kind of vibe, right? It's like, it's almost like, okay, here's what you need to be, here's what you need to embody. But the mother is like, okay, I will do anything for you because of what you've done for me, and you did it without even asking, and now my devotion comes freely and it pours forth from me because you gave of yourself without me even I didn't give you anything. Like you just gave it freely. And so now I give back freely.
That's it. And that's why now when I do podcasts, before I used to talk about the lady, but in a more hidden way, in a more subtle way. I didn't speak about her as openly as I do now. And it was the conversation that I had with Chris and knowing more about her story and what she said to him about how necessary it was for people to know about her now, that made me make the decision to be completely transparent now about my experiences with her.
I'm so glad that you are, and I'm so glad that this is good timing for this podcast then, because that's really this kind of stuff I've been wanting to talk to you about for a long time. So what can like anyone listening right now, if they have a desire to engage with this, what I can only call a power, that's what I would call her, a power or a current, or it's the same idea, right? This this being, what can people do? Like what would you, and it's hard to say a universal, obviously, but what would you say to someone that was asking?
Very, very simple, like you did and like I did, except I was not praying for myself. I was praying for 200 other people. But pray.
Right.
Because she comes like Chris Bledsoe was down on his knees praying. I was down on my knees praying, but not for myself, but for these 200 people. You were praying.
I was on my knees too. Yeah.
You were on your knees praying. So I would say pray. Just ask. Because I don't know why Chris speaks about it in his talks. None of us understand why yet, but he said she comes when we're in the most pain and when we have nowhere left to go. And it is like a mother coming to her children. If a mother can sense if her child is in pain, like in another room in the house, she can just, and a mother automatically goes towards her children when they're in pain. A healthy mother, let's be honest, not all mothers are like that. Don't want to, but yeah, a healthy mother is attuned to the needs of that child. And if that child's in pain, she will come and she will help, like you say, because that's what mothers do. And that's what the mother does. And that was the feeling that I had very strongly when I met her again in Monsegur in 2019, just before we had the pandemic times. And in that time, it really felt like that. How a mother will come, and I think pray. I think that is really the way to do it. Pray, like I did, like Chris did, like you did. Empty yourself and humble yourself, and don't be afraid to ask for the help that you need. That's the most important thing. Don't be afraid to ask. But it has to come from the heart and the soul, like in your experience. It has to come from deep within you. You can't say to yourself, okay, I'm gonna encounter the lady and I'm gonna make it happen using manifestation techniques.
Right.
It's the complete opposite to that. It's like, okay, I come to you, mother, with an empty hands. I've got nothing to give you, but I need your help.
Yeah.
And that's what she responds to. She responds to what's inside our hearts. Do you feel that?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that there wouldn't have been a perfect level of sincerity from me at that point unless I was completely humbled and on my knees. And like, I don't think it has to be that way. I was just that stubborn, like.
Yes, for those of us that are not so stubborn as you and I are, I think there's an easier option. Yes, of course. And that's listen, ask and listen.
Mm.
Yeah, you don't have to be completely humble, but we had to be because we are stubborn, like you said. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely have that streak, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah. I want to ask you why it was Sophia that you chose to pray to. Why did you choose her name?
So I um Gnosticism was kind of my way back into a life of the spirit. So I'll give a quick little summary. I grew up in the Methodist Church in southern United States, and
Mm-hmm.
in the South, it's like it's all very Baptisty. Like I don't know
Yeah.
if you know how the Baptists are, but it's like it's very there's a flavor of Christianity here that's pretty much across the board.
Mm-hmm.
It's very Protestant, very like um evangelical,
Yes.
very like you have to spread it um like by hook or by crook, really.
Yes.
And so when I was growing up, it wasn't like put on us. Like it was my mom was just like, "You want to go to church?" And we were like, "Yeah, sure." And we went and I got hooked. I was really into it. And and then, I got later on in life, I got into um I went to college and started like kind of expanding my horizons, and I tried a lot of things, and I tried cocaine and I tried alcohol, and I was like, "Oh, this is doing more than that did." You know?
Ah,
Like this is really connecting me. And
ah,
so eventually what ended up happening was I became a total atheist, materialist. And I think, there's probably some indoctrination in college that went on. I can't blame everyone else, but that definitely was happening.
mm,
Um, and I got to a point where I was completely didn't believe in any of it. I'm like, we're made of particles. We start from nothing, we go to nothing, and there's nothing else to it, right? And
ah,
that led me to a very miserable place. I was very afraid of death, and I was very afraid of
mm,
just all of it because why wouldn't I be? There's just nothing to it. It's a big cipher. And so but then I had some experiences like I lived in a house that was like very haunted, and that really was the first thing that shook me back into this idea that there's something more, because I
mm,
couldn't deny my experiences in that
mhm.
place. Like it was just that intense.
Yeah.
And then, through I became a heroin addict eventually, just kind of, you start out with a pill and then the next thing you know, it's like, oh, this is good too. And anyway, there's more to it, but just a summary. I I had an overdose and I experienced a near death experience where I saw the Norse god Odin.
Oh, wow.
And I was in a forest and saw an old man with a wide brimmed hat and one eye coming towards me. And I woke up, and my wife at the time was like slapping me, said I had turned blue, that I wasn't breathing. And she was like hitting me and pounding on my chest. And I came to crying out, Odin, Odin, Odin. So that really started me down the path of like, okay, there are beings, there are like this. And it turned out that I have a lot of German, Norwegian ancestry, but I didn't know it at the time because like my mom thought a different guy was her dad, and it turned out that this other guy was her dad, and just weird stuff like that happening. And so that got me down the road of looking into magic and occultism and esoteric, realms and all that. But so all that so much to say that Gnosticism, when I discovered that, because I had a buddy that showed me two podcasts. One was Rune Soup, which is a chaos magic podcast, and the other
Mhm.
one was Aeon Bite, which is a podcast, as we know, like that's where I heard you the first time.
Yeah.
And Miguel's been on this show.
Yeah.
Um, and that was a way back in it for me because the I wasn't interested in the dogmatic Christianity that I grew up with. Like even though I'm coming back to a way of seeing the world that's much more magical, much more spiritual, I was still not willing to look um at the dogmatic Christianity. And I always thought one of the biggest problems I had with the Old Testament was with the Bible was, why is the Old Testament God such a tyrant? like he strikes Onan dead for masturbating. Like, what? This is not the God that I want to hang out with.
No.
And like he's like demands that you kill everyone in the city. Like he blows up Sodom and Gomorrah. Like just all these stories of like, okay, there's something wrong going on here. But I always vibed with the message of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a disconnect there that didn't make sense. And so, but I needed to explore that because I don't think I had really gone. So anyway, the Gnosticism really opened that up for me. And I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Oh my gosh, this is another thing. Like I found out about Sophia and about the divine feminine in Gnosticism, that there's a goddess that has been basically removed from all the scriptures. The scriptures with her have been either burned or hidden or buried or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a really strange experience at my friend's house, that he's the one that got me back into all this stuff. And we were, this when I was still in full blown active addiction. So I think we were on a little bit of acid or something. So it's not like we were just totally, you know, sober, but I personally don't think it matters, because the experience was an external experience. We were talking about this. We were having the same conversation about why is the Old Testament God so evil? You know, what is going on? And my phone glitched out completely, and it had like a rainbow static on it. I've never seen an iPhone do this,
No.
but when it came back, there was a Google search screen on it with a search term in the search field that said Keziah Dinah. I don't know what those names mean, but the results that came up were of from this. It's like, I think you can still find it. It's like a encyclopedia of like Hebrew women, and what the page that particular names brought up on my search was about Job actually having a first wife,
Gosh.
whose name was Uzit, and she was stricken from the records completely. But in the original story, when Job was in the desert tearing out his hair and weeping and crying, Uzit was the one taking care of the family.
Wow.
And there's a story of how she died, and it's like she dies in total shame and poverty after the devil has like convinced her to sell her hair for bread.
Gosh.
And I know I was going to try to make a synopsis, but it's obviously a very long story. And so to me, I said, what showed me that? And who showed me that? And why is that important? And I realized, oh, that's her. That's what's happened to her. She's been removed from the story. She's been taken out. And she is the one that was holding up the whole thing. But she's been removed.
Wow.
And then what do we get? And so when it was time for me, so it wasn't until later that I hit rock bottom. But somehow I knew then that she was the one that could help me, because she'd shown up to me before, and in that way.
Yes.
And that's how I knew to call to Sophia. And it was really, Miguel has been instrumental in that for me too, because, you know, just his podcast bringing that information to me.
Very powerful.
Wild stuff.
And we're all somehow part of this kind of, I don't know if the word is renaissance, I guess, you know, in which the divine feminine is returning after having been cast out in such a way, deliberately cast out as well, I might add.
Yeah, and that's important, I think.
Because you know, of course, in the early church, that women were part of Jesus' ministry. You know, that's not just a legend; it's a true truism. And the earliest churches were run by women in their homes. So it said that Mary Magdalene was a wealthy woman who funded his ministry at times, and had her own initiatory path. And there are academic books, about this, which talk about the early church and the roles of women within it. Women were permitted to baptize, they were permitted to read the scriptures, they were permitted to teach, back in the day. All of that's changed. And it was made as well that Jesus was a celibate guy,
Right.
And of course,
which is like, come on.
Sorry?
I said, which is like, come on,
Yeah, not married and so on, when of course any Jewish man at that time would have been married at a certain age. So, there's so many things that we look back on and that have been changed to fulfill an agenda. And part of that agenda has been, of course, that if a person becomes a monk or a nun, if they are from a wealthy family, as was the case in Occitania with the Cathars, all their land that they would have been given to their children goes to the church. Same with their money, it all gets given to the church to expand their empire. It's very cunning when you think about it.
Yeah.
So, a lot of the lands which were given to the church were given in that way. So much has been changed. I think what's happening now with Gnosis is they're starting to see that Christianity has some value. It does, and it's just what's being done with it. Because we've been deceived about what it's really about. And I think that's why also the Cathars are becoming more of interest to people, because they know there's something hidden in their teachings which give a flavor of what that used to be. And so I do think that that's what's happening, this divine feminine that we are experiencing, that it's almost as if what was before is coming back again, as with the lady. And we're becoming aware of how we've been deceived, actually.
Yeah, and that's the true meaning of apocalypse, right? Is the lifting of the veil.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm glad you brought up Mary Magdalene, because I've been wanting to talk about her, but we hadn't touched on it yet. But of course, she flows under this whole conversation.
Yeah.
In my estimation, it's like you can't really have Jesus without Mary Magdalene, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are inextricable.
Yes.
Inextricably linked. And yet, this is being done. They are being separated. They have been. And she's been kind of, she's just a wild woman of the woods or something, right?
Yes.
And yet, I personally don't think, I don't think you get Jesus without Mary Magdalene. I just don't. And then, that's like sacrilege, but oh well, that's what we do here.
Not sacrilege at all. What is that way? Like, what is it that you feel about that? Where does it come from in you?
Say that again, sorry?
What is it that makes you feel that way about it? Like, where does it come from within you?
I mean, from my own experience, I think that some mysteries can only be passed from the body of the goddess as embodied by a mortal woman.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's true.
I had Dr. Joanna Kujawa on here, and she talks a great deal about that in her work.
Yeah.
And I think there's the very tantric idea to it, right? That like these mysteries are transmitted physically.
They are.
And which brings me to this brings me to the Holy Grail, right? Because I think that that's what the Holy Grail is, personally. Now, I know probably more about that than I do. So, you know,
Yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
no, I just wanted to agree with you that these mysteries are transmitted physically. Yeah, I agree.
And in my estimation, the Holy Grail is Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
Now there may be more to that, right? What is that something that what is your thinking there?
I think that that is that huge topic, the Holy Grail, but I certainly think one aspect of it is Mary Magdalene, yes, definitely.
Do you think it was also a physical object? Or have you what I know you've done a lot of research on this and I've done very little.
Yeah, it's because of where I was living in France, the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, of course, is based around that whole area of France, which just does posit that the Holy Grail is Mary Magdalene, is the bloodline of Christ. And I think there is a lot of truth in that, but I don't think it's only that. I think there are different aspects to it.
Right.
I think it's again like we speak about the lady, the same topic with different manifestations, different, the same root system with different manifestations.
Right.
Yeah, like I spoke with a man called Tim Wallace Murphy, who's written quite a few books about this type of thing before he passed away. And I asked him, what do you see the Holy Grail as? And he said the Holy Grail is whatever people want it to be, and that's its magic. That's its magic.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I think it's different things to different people depending on their quest.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, for sure.
Mm. Yeah,
Just as the symbol of the cup is an archetype.
that's right. And it is pre-Christian, of course. And so is, this idea of communion from the cup is a very important one as well. And then we get into questions about what was in the cup and water and bloodlines and what gets passed down in family lines and so on and so forth. Then we're getting into all kinds of different territories. I do believe that Mary Magdalene went to France. I do believe that she did. I just don't think she went to St. Bone. I think she went further afield and into the region of Occitania. I do think that is the case, and that is what the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail was essentially saying in the book. And one of the authors of that, Henry Lincoln, he lived not far from me in France, and so I got to spend a bit of time with him before he passed away. And he is still of that opinion, was still of that opinion. And there is documentation that shows potentially that Mary Magdalene was in a place called Rennes-les-Bains, staying with a woman called Claudia Procula. So there are little things here and there. What I find a lot as well with these stories is that we have a kind of decoy story, and then we have the real story. We have a decoy place, and then we have the real place. So in the case of the story about Mary Magdalene, the decoy could be Saint Bon, the real place is more likely to be Montségur, Rennes-les-Bains. The decoy could be Rennes Chateau, but the real place is Rennes-les-Bains. So there's this kind of thing in, this whole story about a decoy place, which gathers all the pilgrims to it. There's like another one where they reckon they have the bones of Mary Magdalene. There are so many different decoys, and it's the same with the Holy Grail. So many different places claiming to have the Holy Grail and to know what it is or what it was. And so I think with many of these stories, the most interesting aspect is where it takes you. It's the quest. It's not what you do at the end of it. It's the going, it's the doing.
Yeah, the journey itself.
For the last 10 years, traveling from place to place to place in France before ending up in Montségur and Rennes-les-Bains. It's the journey. If I'd known at the beginning, okay, well, what's going to happen to you is this, this, and this, and then you're going to end up here. It would have ruined the fun, wouldn't it? I would have just been impatient to get the end result.
Right.
So I'd say the grail is really like that. I think the grail is kind of it's a metaphysical object, and at the same time it is a bloodline, and at the same time it is a metaphor for something else, you know. And here I am right now in Glastonbury, which has its own grail stories, of course. So I've come from one grail place to another, and you know, they call Montsegur the Grail Mountain. They say it's the one of the hiding places of the grail. And it could well be that there are more than one grails, and that's what I personally think.
I
And
like
what would be, if we found the Holy Grail, what would it do? What would its significance be?
I wonder if it's not one of those things, and you kind of touched on this, but it's almost like when you try to look at an electron, it stops being what an electron usually is, and it starts to either be, it takes on this very discrete locale and identity based on the fact that you're looking at it.
Yeah.
But when you turn away, it's like doing 5 things at once.
Yeah.
Like you just said. And so I like the idea of the layered meaning of what the grail is. And where others might say, like, oh, that's a cop out, I'm like, no, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
It's
not a cop out. Excuse me, because I've been to these places.
Well, and also I think that we have a very narrow these days we just have a very narrow understanding of what is real and what the answer is able to be. Like for me, a metaphor is just as important as a material reality.
Yeah.
It's just there's no priority in my mind on material over metaphorical, spiritual, dream, any of that. It's all the soup that flows together to make the thing what it is.
Yeah, I believe that too. You know, I say a lot of the time, a lot of what we have is only metaphor.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's valuable or important.
I think we're actually entering into a time, and I've said this before, and you know, this should be my harebrained ideas of it, but we are entering into a time in which truth will be more readily available through metaphor than it is through the evidence of my eyes. Because what are we entering into a time of? A time when you can create any image with the use of a computer program, and you're not going to be able to tell what's real just by your eyes.
Yeah.
And so I have to have some sort of an intuition. I have to have some sort of a metaphor or a model for reality that includes more than just my 5, and obviously there's more senses than this, but like my 5 senses.
Absolutely.
And if I can only dictate what's true by those things, I'm going to be in dangerous territory.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe the Holy Grail is something like the fountain of youth, maybe it's some kind of thing you can put some kind of potion into and something will happen. But we don't know, in fact. We don't know.
And there's part of me that hopes we continue to not know.
Yeah. Richard said something to me once. He said, you never get happy people searching for the Holy Grail.
Right. That's a good point, right? It's always like these arduous, dusty quests.
Yes. You never get someone who's quite settled in their life and, got a nice little easy job that they like and a nice setup with their wife or partner or whatever. They don't go on grail quests.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, I think it's like the spiritual quest in general. It's an initiation and a series of initiations. You don't just get one initiation and then it's all over. That's a misunderstanding of what initiation is. Each time we pass through one, we have to then go through another and another and another. It's never really over.
Yeah, and the moment I think I'm there is when I'm most lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that's where humility comes in, which we were talking about earlier, and prayer, recognizing, we do co-create reality. I do believe that. But at the same time, we have a reality that exists outside of ourselves, which we have to interact with.
Yeah, that's the co part, right? Like I don't just do it myself. I'm doing it with everybody.
Yeah, that's right. And we do have the capacity to make miracles happen. Let's not forget that either, The lady is real, and my experiences are real, because Bledsoe's are real, she's there. And I think, like you said, more and more people are going to become aware of her now as time is moving into.
And I hope that this conversation helps chip away at that, right? Like that's what we're doing. We're out here
Yeah.
kind of sharing our experience of.
Well, you had your life saved by her, essentially.
Yeah, I did. I did. Thank you so much for coming on and for talking to me. I've really enjoyed it. Is there anything like before we go that you want to leave people with, or anything that you want to promote, or we want to let people know about?
Yeah, I would just say, whatever's coming, whatever's happening in your life at the moment, just remember that help is at hand if we just ask for it. We just need to remember that we don't have to do all of this alone. We are not alone. And this is not all that there is. This physical body is not all that there is. And our circumstances may seem difficult, but they often are that way because we're being put in a certain situation so that we can remember this. Sometimes we have to lose everything in order to find ourselves again. And I know a lot of people have gone through a lot of things in the last few years with the COVID times, and a lot of people have lost a great many things, as you were saying yourself as well. And I really think that there is a reason for that, and it's not just the powers that be wanting to disempower us. I feel that there's a more spiritual reason, and that is sometimes we have to lose everything to find the spirit again, like Chris Bledsoe did. And then to receive something much more than we could have imagined for ourselves. I couldn't have imagined what was coming for me. And I know in my own case, where I get willful is when there's a gap, there's an empty space. And I know something's coming, but I don't know what it is, and it hasn't happened yet, or I have a hunch, but it's still not happened yet. Then I can get very willful. And that's when I start to think I have to do it by myself. And that's when I forget almost my experiences with the lady, The weird thing, it's almost like a switch in levels of consciousness, like tuning into a different frequency on a radio. Then I can get like, oh, well, it doesn't matter. That's irrelevant, Where is she now anyway, like.
Right. Yeah. And I think the word you used to me that most describes that is forgetting. I forget.
Yes.
And so my intention every day is to remember who I am, remember what this is. And it can get hard because I'll immediately forget. I'll get out of bed and I just forget.
This is the key. I don't know if you know the work of a guy called Gurdjieff, but like his work is all about helping us to remember, to get out that habitual false self that we were talking about, and remember. And sometimes maybe the easiest thing to remember to do is just to get down on your knees.
Yeah.
And say thank you, Sophia. Thank you that I'm still here. Thank you for giving me the gift of life, and helping me to do the work that I'm doing, bringing all these different people together, and doing the show and reaching so many different people's lives. It's so hard to remember. It's so hard, even for me, even with everything that I've experienced, I can get into the state of forgetting as well. Yeah.
And I think that's really part of it, right? Like that's part of the dance, and that's part of just the experience of being here, is that if I didn't forget, I wouldn't get to remember. And so I've been told that they're the same experience, that my forgetting is my remembering. It's kind of like the this idea that Rumi talks about in some of his poetry, where it's like my crying out in desperation for the God is the God arriving. And I see that very much with the mother too, right? Like you talked about, like the baby cries out. The baby crying out is the same event as the mother arriving.
Yeah, yeah,
Very
yeah.
good.
So for your viewers, like listeners, I would not want to promote anything. I just feel like if they want to find me and talk to me, they can look at my website. If they want to book a reading or have a conversation about their own experiences, they can do that on the website. For me, I think the most important thing right now is just to continue spreading the word about this and making people able to remember, helping them to remember. That's right. Because this is a global forgetting, you know, it's
Right.
part of what's happening. And I think what's happening in our world right now is never before has our attention been so captured by the internet specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the media machine.
Yeah.
I call it the ziggurat. There's different, names for it, right? But it's a panopticon, and it's like it draws attention, and it doesn't care what kind of attention it gets.
Yeah.
I can sit there and like just channel hate into it, or I could
Yeah.
sit there and channel love into it, and it
Yeah.
doesn't care. It just wants the energy.
That's it, precisely. Yeah.
And we can starve it.
Sorry?
We can starve it. But go ahead with what you were saying.
Feeds off us, exactly. Our imaginations are being colonized.
Right.
And so
Yes.
the first thing to do is we need to reclaim our imagination above all and try to detox from too much information that's coming in. So that's how we find gnosis. We can't find gnosis from a million different energy and information sources that are coming in at the same time. It's too much. So to go back to that simplicity all the time, simplicity all the time. And okay, what do I need to know right now in this moment? What do I need to do right now in this moment? Who and what do I need to align with in this moment? What do I feel in this moment? What do I need in this moment? Who is my source? Who am I connected with in this moment? You know, I think we're so pulled out of ourselves, aren't we, consistently with what's happening? Those simple things, you know, they're really important for our own gnosis, because gnosis is knowing, and it's our inner knowing. And if we can't know it, how can we really know anything else?
Always from within. And if it is from without, it's always confirmed in my experience within.
Absolutely.
It has to ring in that spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's
Gnosis begins with the self, the true self.
Yeah.
And you know, my job with people is simply to help them to remember that, to remove those veils which obscure the remembrance of who we really are. Yes.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again so much for coming on. I had a great time talking to you. It's been awesome.
Thank you too. Thank you for having me. And I hope this is useful to your listeners, you know.
Oh, it will be. So you enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime soon.
Great.
Do you experience weird shit? Do your parents not like to tell their friends about what you do in the woods? Do you make more friends in a graveyard than you do at a party populated by living humans? Do you have interactions with beings that are not strictly considered human? Do other people look at you like you're crazy when you mention talking to trees in casual conversation? If you fist pumped or even just answered yes to any of these questions, you may be a Nightbird. So let's sing together. If you'd like to come on the show and flap your gums with me, share your stories, or just talk about the malleable nature of reality for a while, then send me an email at tim@nightbirdpodcast.com. That's tim@nightbirdpodcast.com. I'd love to have you on the show. But until then, I gotta fly. But before I go, let me say this. Remember, you are never alone. I believe you.